Hey everybody. So just finished another live video on sort of how to type people, sort of the philosophy behind different approaches, methodologies, some pitfalls. And I was sort of poking around and was reminded of this classic internet battle that was waged, I don't know, 10 years ago or something. And then typology community about whether or not Bill Gates is an ENTJ or INTP. And I thought this would be actually sort of a good example to go through when talking about the the approach or the methodology with typing somebody or arguing about whether somebody is a particular type or not. And and in my mind, what makes sort of a fundamentally sound argument. Um, Now, I'm not taking any sort of position here whether I think Bill Gates is an INTP or an ENTJ or anything or any other type for that matter. But what I want to talk about is just sort of the neat of the sort of mechanics of the argument. Like, what's going to make a logically sound argument if you are um, either trying to argue for or against somebody being of a particular type. Um, you can find some videos. I think Dave Superpowers was the first person that made the first shot in the war, and put up a video about how Bill Gates is an INTP, and then another pretty popular website at the time, which was Celebrity Types, I think at the time, but I think they changed their name to IDR or something like that. And they made a response video to it and just sort of laid out their argument for why they thought Bill Gates was an ENTJ and not an INTP. And I'll leave it to you to sort of find the articles and the videos that were posted on it, assuming they're still up. But what I wanted to talk about was just sort of, you know, again, sort of using the um, methodologies and sort of the logic behind what I was talking about when typing somebody. How do you go about making sort of a sound argument here, right? So let's start off with the position somebody wants to make the argument that Bill Gates is an INTP. Again, I'm not making any claim whatsoever, but it's just out there. So somebody is saying Bill Gates is an INTP. Now, right away, that's a falsifiable claim, or it should be, right? If this whole personality stuff is going to survive any sort of scientific scrutiny, then whatever claims you're making under it, any sort of theories like Bill Gates is an INTP, then that must be falsifiable, right? And like I described in my previous video, I think the best approach in sort of falsifying whether or not something is true is to try to find counter examples of the conjecture being made here, right? So the conjecture is Bill Gates is an INTP. If you follow the sort of socionics model or the model put out under thinking or talking with famous people, and probably several others out there, then the way that you would falsify the conjecture of Bill Gates as an INTP is you would say, okay, well, if he's an INTP, then he should have a polar function like all types do. And his as an INTP polar functions is SE, extroverted sensing, right? Because it's in the INTP 7th slot. So they have introverted sensing in the 3rd slot, so therefore extroverted sensing in the 7th slot. And so extroverted sensing should be his polar function. And so, if you're going to try to make the argument that Bill Gates is not an INTP, you want to find some counter examples where you show that he is not SE polar, right? So um, if again, under the model, you have a conjecture that all INTPs have a polar function, or SE is the polar function of all INTPs, something like that, right? So if you want to go about proving that somebody is not an INTP, you look to see, well, are they polar in that in that function that should be their polar function? Do they have problems with it? And if you could come up with counter examples to show that they clearly are okay in SE, and it's clearly not their blind spot given the evidence that we have, then that refutes the conjecture that this person is an INTP. So hopefully everybody's following that, right? Now, the problem with the sort of back and forth on this argument is, I mean, IDR was, or celebrity types or whoever, was trying to take it from a scientific, like, falsifiable approach, but was just sort of going at it from a different angle, right? Um, they were, trying to falsify, the other functions by showing, he's more extroverted thinking than he is introverted thinking, or he's more um, extroverted intuition than he is introverted intuition, and so on. But that, to me, like I always say, is just sort of who's going to scream the loudest, right? Who's just going to find more evidence to support that, this person is on that side versus this side. And anybody like Bill Gates, you're going to find plenty of evidence of him using extroverted thinking, and you're going to find plenty of evidence of him using introverted thinking. Same with intuition. You're going to find plenty of evidence for extroverted intuition and plenty for introverted intuition. And so if you really, and just by showing that, I've been able to find more evidence for extroverted thinking than introverted thinking, isn't really falsifying anything. All you're doing is just sort of piling more evidence in your favor. Now, yeah, you could probably win an internet argument like that, but is it the most sound or the soundest way to make the argument? And I would argue, really, what you want to try to do is zero in on the polar function. INTPs should have polar SE. And if I want to falsify that guy's argument, the other guy's argument that Bill Gates is an INTP, then I should just show counter evidence. I should show evidence of him showing, pretty functional, high functioning SE, right? Now, of course, easier said than done. And I realize that any sort of evidence is always going to be subject to interpretation and scrutiny. But if you sort of just take a step back, right? And you think of Bill Gates and you think of an INTP, yes, Bill Gates sort of gives you that INTP vibe, right? And I can easily see why somebody would walk away thinking Bill Gates is an INTP, because he just gives you that vibe, whatever that vibe is. Bill Gates certainly has it. But I would also argue that it's probably pretty easy to find a lot of examples of Bill Gates not only using extroverted sensing, but using it pretty reliably and at a high level, right? Um, Nobody, if you have polar SE, that generally means that you have a hard time initiating action or taking action, or, like I like to put it, just pulling the trigger, making a decision in sort of real time. And, it's an action function. Doesn't necessarily have to mean, being, physical interaction, like being athletic or, skiing or skydiving or anything like that. Yes, that could be part. of extroverted sensing, but the bigger um, the bigger essence of SE is this like ability to take action. And INTPs and INFPs are sort of notorious procrastinators, notorious ditherers, right? They like to sort of sit and think about all the other sort of possibilities and all the other ways that things could play out. And they just generally have a hard time making decisions because, you know, first of all, they have all that, extroverted intuition going on. So they're thinking of all the possibilities and everything. But then that is dampening, I would argue, because it's their tool function, that's dampening their extroverted sensing because they're so hung up on the extroverted intuition and all the possibilities that they have a hard time just sort of picking one and going, right? Which is what SE would do for you. Now, maybe Bill Gates, maybe if you sort of read everything out there and watched all the interviews and really got to know Bill Gates and put him through testing or whatever, maybe you would find that he, has that he's SE polar. But my without having looked too deeply into it, my assumption is you could probably find a lot of evidence, a lot of counter examples of him again using SE, not only just using it, but using it well, using it pretty reliably. I just find it very hard to believe that a CEO of any company, let alone Microsoft, would have a hard time pulling the trigger. Now, that being said, I'm happy to listen to counter arguments. Somebody could say, "Oh no, Paul Allen made all the decisions while Bill Gates just dithered about everything and procrastinated, and we had all these other people, Steve Ballmer and Paul Allen, were really the guys behind the scenes making everything happen." And I would listen and I would say, "Oh, okay," but if I'm able to find, pretty reliable evidence that, he is not SE polar, then I think that is the best way of countering the argument or refuting the argument or the proposition or conjecture that Bill Gates is an INTP, right? Now, at this point, all we've done is just made our case that he's not an INTP, but that means he could be any of the other ones other than INFP, right? Because INFP would also be SE polar. So then we sort of switch positions, right? In sort of the debate. Or we switch we go from, I guess, defense to offense, right? Our first position was we got to refute the proposition or the conjecture that he's an INTP by showing counter examples of him, not being SE polar. So then we have to come up with, okay, well, do we think he's an ENTJ? And there, now you're sort of on the other side of the equation and you're just sort of trying to find evidence of his quote unquote ENTJ-ness. And, if he's in ENTJ, now that's going to make his polar, sort of coincidentally in a way, his polar function would be, he would be polar on the SI function, right? Because in an ENTJ, extroverted sensing is the third function and introverted sensing is the seventh function and therefore his polar function. And so you'd want to try to find some evidence that he's polar in SI. Now, of course, that's very hard to do without directly testing him and giving him a bunch of SI questions. And to IDR's credit, they make the statement in their video, you can't prove a negative, right? And so you can't necessarily prove that he's SI polar, but you can at least show that there's better evidence of him being SI polar than evidence of him being SE polar, right? So if you're trying to make the argument that he's an ENTJ and you're trying to find examples of him being SI polar, you would sort of look around for examples of him just having some sort of deficiency, or, um, deficiency is really the wrong word, but just, not engaging SI in the same way that all the other types do, um, that are not SI polar. And, and some examples of that might be, or yeah, if you're trying to find him being SI polar, you look around for examples of, does he tend to, sort of not remember specific details about events and sort of talk about specific events and generalities. For example, somebody interviewed him and said, "Hey, tell me about the moment that you thought of Microsoft Windows, the operating system or something," assuming he was the one that did that. Um, if he were SI polar, he would describe it in more general terms. He'd be like, "Yeah, I was just sort of, um, hanging out at my computer and talking to my friend, and like I always do, and just sort of came up, along the way, and not really giving you specific details about the moment, not really giving you specific details about, the episodes that led to him coming up with the idea, or just really any other sort of examples where somebody asks him, "Hey, can you recall the time that such and such happened?" Now, if it turns out that you find a bunch of examples where he shows really strong SI for one reason or another, and there could be lots of ways in which he shows really strong SI. Now maybe, it's not, maybe he's not an ENTJ, if yeah, and you might have to sort of reject that hypothesis and go on to the next one, right? Um, so point being here, again, is not whether or not he's an ENTJ or an INTP. I'll let you, the internet can decide that. But it's more about the methodology. It's more about what tactics or mechanics do you use to make your argument, to make a sound argument, rather than just trying to find more data that fits on your side of the scale than the other person's side of the scale. Instead, you want to say, okay, if this person really is an INTP, then they must have a polar function of SE, extroverted sensing. And I'm going to find a bunch of counter examples that show that they are clearly not SE polar. They clearly have, some ability to use SE. It might not be dominant. It might not, it might not even be in their front stack, but it's clearly not polar. And if you can show those counterexamples, then the other person either has to accept them as counterexamples, and move on and reject their conjecture or their hypothesis, or you can engage in the lifelong debate of whether or not that's really SE and all that. And that's just sort of moving the goalposts and playing a lot, playing with definitions to sort of protect your argument. Um, and then, you know, so that's just refuting somebody's argument that he's an INTP. And then the next step would be, okay, I think he's an ENTJ, or I think he's an ESTJ, or something like that. And then trying to show some sort of evidence that he is polar in whatever polar function ENTJs have, right? So that would be SI. And again, you're not going to necessarily prove a negative, but you could at least make a stronger case for him being an ENTJ as opposed to an INTP. And of course, the people on the INTP side will look at, try to find counter examples of him showing strong SI. Again, not necessarily dominant, but just clearly not polar. Um, and again, I'll leave it to the internet to do the detective work. The only point I'm trying to make is, how do you frame the argument? What are the mechanics that you use? Because if you do anything else and you just try to find more evidence of him being an extroverted thinker than an introverted thinker, that's just piling evidence on top of evidence, and it's really not proving anything. It's just screaming the loudest. Um, Instead, you want to really attack the other person's argument by by making it into a falsifiable claim and then showing counter examples of why their argument doesn't hold up. And that, to me, again, is the beauty of the model or the approach of looking at the polar function first. And when you're typing somebody and just trying to figure out, okay, where's their polar function? Where do they seem to have some sort of, blind spot where they want to flip in, out of that function into a different function to solve the task. Um, that's going to provide a much more logically sound argument, because otherwise it's just back and forth, back and forth, back and forth with, finding evidence that just is confirmation bias, affirming your conjecture, however you want to put it. Okay, well, for those of you who aren't familiar with the argument or the sort of online debate that was going on, it's kind of funny. I was reminded of it tonight and thought that served as sort of a good example of the points I was trying to make in my earlier stream. Okay, thanks, and I hope to see you later.